My name is Ralph Ben-Murgy, and I host a podcast called Not That Kind of Rabbi. Basically, what I'm doing is looking for the spirit in people, what animates them to do what they do, and the kinds of stories they can tell. You know, people believe they don't have a story. Oh, no, I don't really have much of a story. And then when you talk to them or ask them questions, you'll find out everybody has a story and that they're all wonderful. I think it's a really good idea for us not to become parochial, not to just think of ourselves, the Jewish people this, the Jewish people that. So many people of different faiths and different inclinations have so much to offer to us as Jews, but also to the world in general. So I tend to look for the spark in people more than I look for the affiliation in them. To support our work at the CJN, go to thecjn.ca/donate. And if you're Canadian, you'll even get a tax receipt.
Welcome to Bonjour Chai, the Deal or No Deal edition. I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy. Abby couldn't make it today. This week, I talk with Israel-based journalist Lahav Harkov to discuss the possible deal between Israel and Hamas that may have happened by the time you're listening to this. Or might not have happened. Here's that interview now. Welcome to Bonjour Chai. This is Phoebe Maltz Bovy reintroducing Lahav Harkov, who is a senior political correspondent at Jewish Insider covering Israeli politics and diplomacy, and who better to speak with us right now. Lahav, welcome back to Bonjour Chai.
Thanks.
And we last spoke I was just checking, it was November 2023, and to put it mildly, things have happened since November 2023. Where would you say we are at today? Today, Thursday, January 6th, just after 9 a.m. Eastern Time here in Toronto, where I am.
Well, right now, I mean, the talk is about a hostage/ceasefire deal, right, between Israel and Hamas, which in some ways is where we were in November also, but a lot of other things happened in between, right? So in November, we actually did have the deal and over 100 hostages were released. And now, as we're talking, a deal has been announced by everyone but Israel, sort of, everyone involved with Israel. So the U.S., first President-elect Trump announced the deal. And then finally, Biden joined in, and the Prime Minister of Qatar and Hamas. And the only person saying that there's not a deal yet is Israel, because they're saying that there are sort of last minute details and things that Hamas has not agreed to yet that are in the deal. And then the things that you're hearing from the other sides, and these are sort of off the record official speaking, but they're saying, yeah, they're not such big deals. There's these little details that need to be worked out. Right. So you could chalk that up to sort of differences in approach where Israel's no, we're not going to announce a deal until all the details are worked out. My theory is to some extent that it's to put pressure on Israel, right, to close these final details more quickly. But we also have a domestic issue in Israel, which is that there's a real possibility that Netanyahu's governing coalition is going to fall apart over this hostage deal. I don't necessarily think that that's the holdup of the deal, because Netanyahu can sort of agree to the deal and there's still going to be a cabinet. There's going to be what's called a security cabinet meeting, which is a smaller group of ministers, and then the full cabinet, and they have to vote. So he still has time sort of in Israel, even if the deal is final. But things are very tricky right now in Israel. Let's say we're in the final stages of the deal. And by the time this comes out, we might even know how things.
Yeah, so that is what I hate to do too much guesswork, but do you think by the time our listeners are hearing this in approximately 12 hours from now, there will be a deal?
I think I do think so. I think there's only so long that this could be drawn out, unless Hamas unless Hamas brings up even more new demands, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that's going on is that, there's going to be a huge release of Palestinian terrorists from prison. And a little more than a year ago, when the hostages were freed, the Palestinians who were released from prison a lot of them were for pretty minor offenses, I don't know, they're not good things, but incitement to terrorism on social media, mm-hmm. or striking a policeman, but with your bare hands, not mm-hmm. heavy hitter terrorists. And now there's going to be heavier hitters being released from prison. And there's this dispute right now. The deal says basically that it's agreed upon by both sides who the which prisoners would get out, which terrorists. And now Hamas wants to sort of take away Israel's veto power, and they want to determine who the list is. And that's important to Israel and Israelis, right? Like the families whose loved ones were murdered by some of these terrorists, like they can petition, they can appeal to the High Court of Justice in Israel, and in theory could stop some of these terrorists from being released, right? So Israel wants to, first of all, not want people who are extremely dangerous to the public to be released, even though some of them surely will be very dangerous to the public, and also to approve a list that will go through relatively smoothly, right? And Hamas wants to say, no, like we have full control over the list. So that's like the last thing, at least as far as what Netanyahu's office is saying, that's being worked on.
So it's hard, I think, maybe from the perspective of a North American. If I see a yard sign that says bring them home now, that's the pro-Israel side. And it's also a bit right-wing coded in my neighborhood of Toronto, which is another thing. It's very hard for me to wrap my head around there being a position to the right of that. You know what I'm saying? The sort of like, don't actually prioritize bringing them home now. Let's do something else instead. So how would you explain the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir position? What is this?
I mean, first of all, I would say that it's not just like extremists who have misgivings about this agreement. I think the sort of mainstream to moderate right-wing position in Israel is this agreement is garbage, but we want to bring the hostages back as soon as possible, so we're just going to swallow our pride, right? It's not like this is like enthusiasm across the board, including it from Netanyahu himself, who's reaching a celebrity. He's going to try to sell it as best as he can, but I think that he knows it's not. It's a tough sell in the sense that everyone's going to think it's a really bad deal.
So what exactly? What are the terms of the deal? Yeah,
right. So the reason that a lot of people are like, this is not a good deal, but it's just the pill we're going to have to swallow, is first of all because if the deal completely goes through and Hamas and Israel follow it step by step, stage by stage, it's going to be over the course of around 3 months. 1,600 terrorists will be released from prison, including ones who have murdered, who are like mass murderers. And Israel is going to withdraw from large parts of Gaza, right? And you have to remember that 800 soldiers have died in this war. That's after October 7th. So this is like Israel's, I think it's the deadliest war since the War of Independence. So, this is really difficult for a lot of people whose loved one died or whose loved ones have just spent hundreds of days fighting in this war to feel like we did all of these things to try to protect Israel, and now we're going to withdraw, not to where we were on October 6th, but not a lot further than where we were on October 6th. And so there are a lot of people who feel unsafe. And so when we had a press briefing earlier this week about some of the details of the agreement that I had questions about that were not answered, for example, is there's this sort of corridor that divides Gaza. It's like a east to west corridor dividing Gaza from north to south, right? And right now the north is evacuated. And part of the deal is that the civilians are going to be allowed to repopulate the north. There's going to be some kind of mechanism to make sure that weapons aren't coming north, because northern Gaza is really close to a lot of population centers. Like there's a city, Sderot, that's right by
of Israeli population centers.
Yeah, Israeli population centers, right? So you have to secure those people, you have to really make sure that the terrorists aren't going back to northern Gaza, right? So there's some sort of security mechanism. And nobody can tell me who's going to be operating that mechanism. Is it going to be the IDF? Is it going to be some sort of UN peacekeepers? UN peacekeepers have not done a very good job in keeping the peace in this region. So, that was one of my big questions, for example, when I was being told about this deal. It's things like that. It's that people want the hostages to come home. Everyone wants the hostages to come home, but people have different ideas over how risky this deal is for Israel's security and whether or not we should risk it or how much we should risk.
What percentage of the Israeli public is in favor of the deal, would you say, and saying where is it? Why hasn't this happened sooner sort of approach?
So I think the polling, and I saw 2 different polls this week, and that basically a majority, something like 55% of Israelis are we'll do anything. We're willing to stop the war. right now to get the hostages back, right? So then you have to think people who are willing to agree to something where you're not totally stopping the war, right? Because this agreement does include Israel maintaining a buffer zone within Gaza and a few other security measures. So you have to think if 55% would agree to those sort of like major concessions by Israel, then a larger percentage will agree to this one, which there are large concessions, but it's not like the polling question, which was sort of like to give up everything.
And would the deal release all hostages or not all hostages?
It's not an easy yes or no question. It's a 3-stage deal. The first stage is 6 weeks long. Over those 6 weeks, 33 hostages who are considered humanitarian cases would be released. Humanitarian cases is children, which would be the 2 redheaded babies.
Are they thought to still be alive or not?
So Israel has not announced their death. There have been some reports and things, but we don't know for sure. If they haven't announced the death, then that means the army doesn't feel like they have enough evidence that they're not alive. I think people should lower their expectations. That's my feeling. And then if they do turn out to be alive, then it would be wonderful. But the list of 33 people includes those 2 children, all of the women, including the female soldiers, and anyone who was wounded. So there's 3 living Americans who are hostages, and 2 out of 3 of them are in that category. 1 is over 50, and 1 is wounded. And then in terms of what else will happen in that stage, so roughly 1,000 terrorists will be released, and Israel will withdraw from population centers in Gaza, but will remain in other parts of Gaza. And then stage 2, so the terms of stage 2 have to be negotiated, like they start negotiating in the middle of stage 1. But in terms of the hostages, in stage 2, the soldiers will be released, the living soldiers. And then at the end of the whole thing, the bodies will be released of those who are living.
And that would be all hostages.
And then you'd get to all the
for
hostages.
In some capacity. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm skeptical that this will last, like that we will go through all the stages and everything will happen according to the deal.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, actually, is just sort of to what extent would this deal mean an end to the conflict itself as opposed to just a certain phase of it? Because, I mean, you see it looks sort of a bit hopeful. I think, it's all going to be peace in the Middle East now. And it doesn't necessarily, I guess what you're saying is it wouldn't necessarily play out like that. Like, is it a pause in a war?
So the first stage is supposed to be a ceasefire, but not necessarily a permanent ceasefire. And then Israel has terms, right, of how to end the war, which would be that Hamas would no longer be in power and someone else would move in to sort of administer Gaza until there could be some sort of local government that's not Hamas, theoretically. And that's part of the negotiation that hasn't been worked out yet. Now, there's like an Emirati proposal, not that the Emiratis would just take over Gaza, but like that they would help in a major way. With cooperation from other countries. Maybe that's what'll end up happening. But the later stages of the deal just they're not put to paper yet. And Israel has said they're not going to end the war with Hamas in charge of Gaza.
I always wanted to work for the CJN, even when it came as a newspaper in our house when I was growing up. It was a celebration. Everything stopped. We read the paper from cover to cover. Hi, I'm Ellen Besner, and I'm a journalist at the Canadian Jewish News, and I host the CJN Daily podcast. The CJN Daily is a way to showcase Canadian Jewish newsmakers around the world and hearing from the newsmakers themselves. I'm proud to do the work to continue to showcase the ways in which our friends, our neighbors, our rabbis are finding ways to find the beauty in their Jewish identity while upholding the civil rights that Canadian Jews have had since 1832. I'm proud to showcase how our community leaders are leading during these turbulent times, but we also hold them accountable too. We can only continue to tell these important stories with your help. Please visit thecjn.ca/donate to support our work, and you'll get a Canadian tax receipt to boot.
If the war did end, do you think there would be 2 states, 1 state?
Well, I don't think the statehood question really comes into it.
That doesn't come into it?
It's not part of it.
I mean, I'm just thinking about how global opinion is very much like, now we see why there needs to be a Palestinian state. There's now this sort of galvanized world excited about the Palestinians, right? Like never before. And there's going to be
Right.
that pressure.
I don't think that mass protests around the world make it more likely for Israelis to support and to allow for a Palestinian state. And I think that Gaza was never going to be the Palestinian state. Like, people who are actually involved in this, they see Ramallah as the capital of the Palestinian state and not Gaza. And there are a lot of problems with Ramallah, but they are at least not Hamas. You know, they are much less radical than Gaza. So, like, I know that, like, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken has talked about this can be the beginning of moving towards a Palestinian state, but it's not actually part of the deal. And I also think that, like, the people who are radicalized on the streets, like, they're marching for there to be no Israel. They're not marching for a two-state solution. I'm not saying there are people who think the war is bad and they want a two-state solution, right?
I just wanted to ask also, so why now? Why is this happening now? Is it more about the state of the war, or is it more about the state of the United States presidential transition?
I think it's a little bit of both. You know, this version of the deal has been on the table more or less since May. And Netanyahu agreed to it in late May, early June. Hamas wanted to change the 29 points, and, you know, Israel was like, that's way too much. And then Hamas never returned to the table again, basically, until now. And what's happened in the interim, right, is that Israel took out the whole, you know, upper echelon of Hezbollah and then eventually reached a ceasefire with Lebanon. Syria collapsed. Israel took out Iran's air defenses. And so the quote-unquote axis of resistance is, like, really battered at this point, and Hamas is not getting support from elsewhere. Also, Israel killed the head of Hamas, Sinwar. And that was after they had already taken out Haniya. So, you know, there's that. Hamas is under a lot of pressure. I do also think that President-elect Trump's sort of comments about there being hell to pay and opening the gates of hell and things like that probably helped really push things along. And his Middle East envoy has strong ties with Qatar, which usually I consider not to be a good thing, but maybe in this case, it helped push Qatar to push Hamas to the table.
So what does it mean if there is a deal for Biden's legacy? Does it much affect that?
First of all, as a fellow American expat, like, I don't think.
And do you want to just spell out where you live? Like, not exactly where you live, but you live in Israel now, right?
Yeah, I live in central Israel, in a small city in central Israel. But I grew up in the U.S. And I think, like, foreign policy is not super high on people's priorities there. So I don't think that, like, to Americans, when you ask what Biden's legacy is, Israel will be that high on the list. Like, maybe like academics who have been, like, radicalized by being Cambridge or whatever the last year, like, it'll be important to them. But for overall, like, it's hard for me to see this being Biden's legacy. But if we want to, like, narrow the question to, like, what we think his legacy will be on Israel, it's interesting. I mean, because I think that he was really sort of inconsistent and not sure what he wanted from Israel throughout the war, because many times, especially in the beginning of the war, he spoke very supportively of Israel, but he would sort of veer back and forth. I mean, like, he wasn't, like, extremely against Israel, right? It wasn't like the people were going out there accusing Israel of genocide, but he wasn't always supportive. And it was the same sort of with the weapons, where on the one hand they sent a lot of weapons to Israel, but they always, like, were like, oh, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't, maybe you're not using them the right way, you know? So it was like, it's hard to pin it down. And I don't know, I don't see the ceasefire, like, I think the fact that the hostage will be coming home is a big achievement, but I don't know if the ceasefire itself is the achievement, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think that that's what's gonna change the Middle East unless we get to the third stage and there's some sort of really real solution there. Maybe not long term, but like a medium term solution there for Gaza that will quiet things down. But that'll already happen after Biden's out of office.
Right. So do you think Trump will claim credit for bringing peace to the region?
Absolutely. I think he's already claiming credit for this deal.
And do you think that's justified?
Like, I think he deserves some of it. Biden sort of came up with this outline, right? I think the IDF put extreme pressure on Hamas over more than a year. But I guess Trump and Witkoff, his envoy, were needed to really seal the deal.
So maybe it's a little bit of unity, a bipartisan warm and fuzzy moment for the states.
Yeah.
I mean, then I also want to ask, like, if it doesn't work out, how badly will that reflect on Biden and or Trump?
Look, if it doesn't work out, I think Biden is where he has been.
Right. I guess yeah, it's not really going to matter.
And with Trump, like, I think this is Trump's first sort of foray into this in 4 years. And so I think if it doesn't work, I don't think it's going to make a huge dent in either of their reputations. The hostage issue is something that, like, for Israelis has become like a big part of the national ethos. And I think it's going to be just really, really hard for Israelis if some hostages don't come home now. I think if, the first stage happens and a lot of, and 33 hostages come back, but then, Hamas doesn't exactly stick to the deal or something like that, then Israelis will accept it. But if it drops right now and the deal doesn't happen, like, I think it's going to be a really rough time. Weirdly, I think for Netanyahu, he'll somehow be safer politically if there's no deal than if there is a deal, because the sort of extreme elements in the coalition are threatening him because they don't want a deal. But publicly, like, I think you're going to have like mass protests in the street, that there haven't been in months and months. There are protests in the street every week to free the hostages, but it's like a few thousand people. They're not huge these days. There were stages at which they were much bigger.
But I wanted to ask, so I asked about Israeli public opinion on the deal, and what would you say is Palestinian public opinion on this deal at this point?
Yeah, but I've not seen polling, so I can't like speak at that level of certainty. At least on social media, which it's hard to know, how much that reflects public opinion, but at least on social media, people seem very happy that there's going to be a ceasefire, and that's understandable. I mean, people are going to be able to go back to their homes, the homes that are, some of them are going to have their homes rebuilt and they don't have their homes to go back to, but those who do will be able to go back. And so that's exciting for people. And those who don't will, have an opportunity to rebuild. So I can see people being very happy about that. And also the Palestinian prisoners issue is a big one in Palestinian society, right? That they often believe that these people are unjustly imprisoned, even in cases when they killed Israelis. They view those people as sort of martyrs to the Palestinian cause. And there's usually, a lot of celebration in the streets when there's prisoners released. So I think we'll probably see some of that.
I have one more question. It's a little bleak. What October 7th showed a lot of people, myself included, is just how hated Israel and Israelis are by not all Palestinians, but and now after a war that if I were Gazan, I wouldn't be thrilled with Israel right now, right? How moving forward can there be any kind of situation where, tell me, how can there be peace in the Middle East? No, but I don't know, like, this sounds like a very trite and sort of timeless question, but I mean specifically since October 7th, right? I don't know. Like, I feel like I used to think, oh yeah, one day there will be two states and everything will be good. And then October 7th happened, and it's hard to imagine how anything could be good.
I mean, I think like I think they need to go through like a societal process of de-radicalization. And that's like sort of where I'm hopeful that if the Emiratis do get involved, that maybe they could do something, because like the Emiratis and the Saudis have experience with that in their own societies where they, the Saudis are still working on it, but the Emiratis have been very successful at having a relatively modern society while at the same time being very traditional religious Muslims. And if they could sort of bring some of that spirit to the education and the textbooks, in Gaza, it'll take time, it'll take years, but hopefully the things will get better. Because like even before October 7th, I had reported on all kinds of like, the European Union, they had been giving aid for like Palestinian education for years. And then they did some sort of audit and they found, all this incitement in Palestinian textbooks. They would talk about important women in Palestinian history, and it would be like, a woman who shot up a school bus and killed 8 children in northern Israel in the 1970s, things like that. And so, that needs to be eradicated. That kind of stuff shouldn't be on TV, and it definitely shouldn't be in schools. Those shouldn't be the people who, streets are named after. And hopefully, if that kind of stuff is not allowed, or at least not common anymore, that over the years, there will be like sort of a different spirit and a different reigning idea among Palestinians.
And do you think it matters that there's now this large faction on the left internationally sort of egging on Palestinians to not do what you just said?
Right. I think it's very unhelpful. The idea of de-radicalization and the idea of having better textbooks had support under sort of, even liberal governments in the West, theoretically, you know, like the EU conducted this audit, right? But the more that people feel like their constituents are radicalized on the Palestinian issue, the less they'll want to, you know, be critical of the Palestinians. And so,
to put it mildly, I do not consider myself radicalized on the Palestinian issue. I consider myself a Zionist. I also think this was and it's been an extremely destructive war. Many people, including children, have been killed, you know. And like I said, if I were Palestinian right now, I would not be too thrilled with Israel, and not because of something I read in a textbook. I don't know. So is there hope? Will there be peace one day? What do you think?
There's always hope.
Okay.
There's always hope. I'm always optimistic, but I just don't think that it's like a short-term thing. Right. Like, I don't think that this ceasefire doesn't mean peace. You know, it's interesting because there's a demand from Israel to end the war and the ceasefire, but I don't see any demand from Hamas or Palestinians to stop their hostilities against Israel, which is one of these things that everybody sort of leaves out of the reporting. So I don't think that this is not a peace deal. It's not. It's a pause in the war that could possibly turn into an end to the war, but it's not a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians.
Well, on that extremely uplifting note, thank you, Lahav, for joining us. Where can people find you?
I write for Jewish Insider. Subscribe to our daily kickoff, is Israel news and also diaspora Jewish news. And I am on Twitter under my name, Lahav Harkov. I'm also on Blue Sky, less active there, but it's...
Are you? Oh, well, then I'll have to find you over there if I haven't already.
Yeah, I find it's a little boring there, so find me. Maybe it'll be more interesting for each other.
Well, thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending January 18th. The show is produced by Michael Fraiman and edited by Zach Kauffman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Fraiman. Our music is by So Called. We are a production of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes at thecjn.ca/bonjour. And you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We would love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai, as it's one of the best ways we get new listeners. As always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.
I'm thinking about my story from last month about Shlomo Mansour, who is the oldest hostage currently being held in Gaza. As a young child, survived the bloody Iraqi Farhud. He went on to live another 70 years in the kibbutz. Then at age 85, was grabbed in his pajamas and violently shoved to his car and driven into Gaza on October 7th. I get emotional when I think about this guy. I'm sorry. It's like, it really affected me. Like talking to his daughter and his grandson. Like this buff kid who's like a personal trainer now, talking about how his Saba, his fondest memory is building a SpongeBob SquarePants doll out of wood with him in the workshop. It was just, it got you, you know? My name is Joel Chaushu, and I'm the Quebec correspondent for the Canadian Jewish News. I think these stories are worth telling. We can do that with your help. Visit the cjn.ca/donate to support our work. You'll get a quarterly magazine and a tax receipt to boot. What's not to love?